Hi, my name's Cassandra Crowe. I'm the Research Manager for the MLC Strategies. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ben McCaw, Senior Portfolio Manager for the MLC Portfolios. Welcome, Ben. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Cass.
Ben, I know you have a keen interest in China. It's an area you've done a lot of research on, and you actually very recently wrote an article in NAB Asset Management's Benchmark magazine on China. In that article, you touched on a number of themes. You spoke about the power of seven with respect to the Politburo Standing Committee, and also I think you made the observation that reform was probably likely. Can you give us an update now as the leadership changes have come through on your thinking around China and what it means for us?
The leadership changes that occurred in October at the Communist Party Congress are extremely important for China. Although there wasn't a change in the two leaders of China that people often talk about, Xi Jinping and Liu Kaching, it's the Standing Committee within the Communist Party of China that's important for formulating policy in China. The old Standing Committee was probably slightly divided in terms of policy. As we all know, Xi Jinping is quite a reformer, but other members of the Standing Committee weren't necessarily against reform, but they were from a much more traditionalist type background. The new committee, however, is much more pro-reform, so I think that she will have a much greater chance of being able to enact reform policy with the new committee.
Can you tell us a little bit now about what this means for China's policy moving forward, and if it's potentially likely that China might move more toward the private sector, for example?
Well, I think it's important to understand, Cass, that policy change in China started a couple of years ago. Up until, let's say, around about 2014, 2015, policy was led by the old regime that stimulated the economy through the financial crisis. But early on in Xi Jinping's first leadership term, we began to see policy change. It didn't necessarily change quickly, but the change was very evident through the anti-corruption campaign, for example, and also through some of the more recent policy changes that have been clamping down on overcapacity and trying to reduce overcapacity in the economy. But like I said earlier, the change in the Politburo Standing Committee, I think, gives Xi a bit more authority to start to implement change further on. And so, yes, I do think you'll see more participation by the private sector in China in the future.
So looking a bit closer to home now, what do these changes mean for the Australian economy and for the Australian investor? Do you think, for example, a hard or soft landing is more likely?
I'm convinced that a hard landing in China is far less likely now than it may have been perceived, say, in 2012, 2013, and that's principally because of a lot of the reforms that Xi Jinping has initiated in the economy. As for Australia, though, I think the important changes within the Chinese economy for Australia have already happened, insofar as that there's been a big reduction in the growth in investment rates in China. But that's not a new phenomenon. That's been in place now for a couple of years, and I just expect that to continue. However, that's not to say that Australia's anchoring into China isn't still important. It's still extremely important. But one, it might be less reliant on iron ore, and two, I think the opening up and some of the trade agreements that have been struck with China will allow other services to access markets in China that will ultimately be important for the Australian economy.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today.
No problem, Cass. Thank you.